and this is Planet Talk. Things are tense and intense right now, especially in the U.S., 2 weeks out from the failed insurgency at the U.S. Capitol, one day before the presidential inauguration. A lot of what is going on is reflective of the Pluto transits that we've been experiencing. Saturn-Pluto conjunction since 2018, Uranus-Pluto square since 2008. There's this feeling that we've been living through a time of intense breakdown. And right now, the sun is lighting this all up. In the transits for today, for tomorrow, the sun is conjunct Pluto, it's conjunct Saturn, and it's square Uranus and Mars. And where the sun goes, it brings light. It helps us to bring consciousness. It helps us to just see what's going on. The U.S., of course, is at its Pluto return, so the dredging up of shadow, the kind of truth excavation that's been going on for the world has been especially intense for the U.S., where we've been facing, the facts of, there was slavery here, and there's a lot of racism, and there's a lot of inequality, in spite of all the good things about this country. Now, one aspect, I want to talk about something that happened today that I think reflects the sun on Pluto and on Saturn, on the Pluto-Saturn conjunction. And this was Biden speaking at the COVID memorial out in front of the Washington Monument, in front of the reflection pool. And he said, "To heal, we must remember." Pluto is not just about destruction and mayhem, although it can bring plenty of that. Ultimately, Pluto can help us heal. It helps us move through the darkness. It helps us destroy what needs to go. We need to heal, and we can't just repress this stuff. We can't just push it out of our consciousness. And so, with Plutonian things, it's important to bring our consciousness there, and to remember. So he also says, "Let us shine a light in the darkness along the sacred pool of reflection and remember all who we lost." So the sun on Pluto, shining a light in the darkness. This idea of the sacred pool of reflection. This is Sun-Pluto imagery, and grief, intense grief is something that we really need to experience. We haven't properly grieved as a nation over COVID because we've been too busy flinging opinions about whether or not it's something to take seriously, about whether or not to wear masks, blah, blah, blah. The fact is, many, 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 many people have died of COVID, and many are still dying, and people who were not affected by COVID until now are suddenly affected. Now, this also reflects Biden's own Pluto-Moon square and Biden's own history, the grief of losing his wife and son. He's a person who's been through hard stuff, and as someone who's been through hard stuff, he's somebody who can legitimately empathize with the pains that people are suffering. Unlike the outgoing president, who really just does not seem to care. Now, moving forward, the big kind of star aspect of the next year is going to be the Uranus-Saturn, or Saturn-Uranus square. And we're feeling that very strongly right now. Right? Saturn, the impulse for control, for preservation, for the status quo, the conservative impulse, tradition, versus Uranus, the rebel, the awakening, the liberating impulse, the urge for something new, for something exciting, to break with the past. These are not cooperative archetypes, and when you put them in hard aspect to one another like a square, things can get pretty intense. Now, I think one of the key words with Uranus and Saturn is freedom. What is freedom and what is the cost of freedom? That's something that comes up with Uranus, Saturn. Now, we're obsessed with freedom in America, right? Freedom it's our catchphrase. It's the word that we would put on a T-shirt and then put over the whole country. Just freedom, 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 freedom. What does freedom actually mean? Now, I recently started reading this writer, Colin Wilson. I'm not too familiar with his ideas yet, but this line stood out to me. He says, oh, and by the way, Colin Wilson was born with a Uranus-Saturn square. He says, a single obsessional idea runs through all my work, the paradoxical nature of freedom. When the German tanks rolled into Warsaw or the Russians into Budapest, it seemed perfectly obvious that what we meant by freedom, or it seemed perfectly obvious what we meant by freedom. It was something solid and definite, and was being stolen as a burglar might steal the silver. But when a civil servant retires after 40 years and finds himself curiously bored and miserable, the idea of freedom becomes blurred and indefinite. It seems to shimmer like a mirage. When I am confronted by danger or crisis, I see it as a threat to freedom, and my freedom suddenly becomes positive and self-evident, as enormous and obvious as a sunset. I have always accepted the fundamental reality of freedom. The vision is not an illusion or a mirage. In that case, what goes wrong? The trouble is the narrowness of consciousness. It is as if you tried to see a panoramic image through cracks in a high fence, but were never allowed to look over the fence and see it as a whole. And the narrowness lulls us into a state of permanent drowsiness, like being half anesthetized, so that we never attempt to stretch our powers to their limits. So, what he's saying in here is, freedom, it's great. And when freedom is under threat, we really know what is under threat, what we might lose. And we know the value of our freedom. But under ordinary circumstances, with life just going as usual, well, we don't really have the same attitude toward our freedom. Not only do we take things for granted, but the kind of spark and joy in life seems to leave. George Carlin, who had Venus at the midpoint of Uranus-Saturn, in one of his bits, he basically says, like, what is this? The freedom to enjoy microwave hot dogs, plastic vomit, fake dog shit, cinnamon dental floss, lemon-scented toilet paper, and sneakers with lights in the heels. Or by the same token, like binging on TV, snacks, alcohol, whatever. A lot of what we enjoy in our freedoms, it's like, well, how free are we really? And how free were the people waging their revolt at the Capitol a couple of weeks ago? Were they free? Are they really seeking? What freedom are they seeking? Now, this comes out in the libertarian impulse as well. Like Ayn Rand was born, I believe, with Mars at the midpoint, and Uranus at the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And she says, the question isn't who's going to let me, it's who's going to stop me. So that, you would hear that from a teenager, right? This is not a kind of mature attitude toward freedom, toward autonomy. It's a kind of lashing out, like, sort of attitude. And that's what we were seeing a couple of weeks ago, and that's what we're going to probably continue to see a lot more of over the next year. Now, it's not just, this aspect doesn't just limit itself to conservatives, libertarians. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez also has this aspect where she has the conjunction Here's a great quote from her. If you were calling for an end to this unrest and you're not calling for an end to the conditions that created it, then you are a hypocrite. So one of the things that we can see with Uranus Saturn is a tendency to fall on one side, um, to identify with Uranus, with all the freedom, with all the the rebel, the revolutionary, liberal, or with the reactionary, conservative, more repressive, controlling side. Or we might see it kind of flip in a kind of yin yang sort of a way, where, in fact, in this quote from Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, who we would think of as more Uranian, because obviously she's liberal, she's very far to the left. We also get that note of Saturnian judgment in here, where she says, if you're calling for the unrest but not an end to the conditions that created it, you're a hypocrite. By the same token, the insurgency a couple of weeks ago, this, we had rebels on the one hand, anarchists, but conservative anarchists. So they're a Uranian bunch carrying Saturn, right? And then also experiencing Saturn from the establishment of the government, or even from, what we might call the liberal establishment. So we'll see these oxymorons with Saturn-Uranus, like the liberal establishment or conservative anarchism. It is so easy with an aspect like Uranus or Saturn-Uranus, Saturn-Pluto. It's so easy to want to simply project onto other people, to identify very strongly with your favored opinion, and then to just try to adjust the world to fit according to it. And if we do that, then we find ourselves just playing roles. And that's essentially what I see these, so-called revolutionaries, conservative revolutionaries doing. They're just playing roles, as are a lot of people on the left as well. Let's remember that everything that's going on out there is also going on in here to a certain degree. We are all experiencing these transits as a collective. We're experiencing the world transits. We're also experiencing them aspecting our own natal charts, which is going to inflect them more personally. But somehow we're going to have to find a way for Saturn and Uranus to work together. We can't just choose one over the other. So we actually have a kind of narrow path before us. The options for how we choose to behave constructively become quite limited. And there's a great quote from Igor Stravinsky, who was born with the Saturn-Uranus trine, the composer. He says, "My freedom will be so much greater the my freedom will be so much the greater and more meaningful the more narrowly I limit my field of action and the more I surround myself with obstacles. Whatever diminishes constraints diminishes strength. The more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself of the chains that shackle the spirit." So to put this into more relatable language, it's like anybody who's ever undertaken any kind of creative project knows the blank page syndrome. It's like, a world full of possibilities, and then you sit down to actually create something, you got the blank page in front of you, and you clam up. This is a very Saturn-Uranus moment, because once we start to make some choices, we start to limit ourselves. And once we start to limit ourselves, suddenly there's all of this stuff that we don't even need to worry about anymore. And that liberates us to follow a path, to choose a path. That's all we need to do. And So for managing the intensity of Saturn-Uranus experience, I think that this idea is worth holding on to. So in America, the land of the free, home of the brave, I think it's important for us to start thinking about what freedom is all about, and if we do have freedom, then what are we going to do with it? Another Saturn-Uranus quote from Eleanor Roosevelt: with freedom comes responsibility. Now, I would say not just responsibility to the community, to the country, to your fellow human beings, but responsibility to your own self to actually be free. To actually be free, to actually cultivate that freedom, to keep it alive. This is the kind of stuff that Saturn-Uranus is really making us think about. Or we could just choose to play a role and either be a really hysterical right-wing person or a really hysterical left-wing person. It doesn't really matter. But the more we're hooking into the play and playing a role, the less we're really truly free. Now, Mars is heating this all up. Mars is conjunct Uranus, and when I think of Mars and Uranus coming together, it makes me think of that movie Mars Attacks, where those aliens with the big brain heads come down, and Uranus representing that awakening power, acting on Mars, the principle of aggression, of conflict, of assertion, but also courage. Now, when these two come together, there's a strong kind of freedom fighter impulse that can arise. Che Guevara was born with this conjunction on his ascendant, and if the ascendant refers to how we come off to the world, how other people see us, well, I think it's safe to say that Che Guevara is seen as, he's kind of held up as the poster boy of freedom fighters. And I mean, he's on God knows how many t-shirts to that effect. It's also just, it's an energy with Uranus as the awakening factor on Mars, of just sudden, reckless behavior, of blowing the top, of, driving too fast, of flashes of anger, impulsive action, reckless, defiant kind of courage. And so I think we see that in the uptick in these violent plans, and things are uncertain. We don't know. It does kind of feel like a powder keg sort of situation right now. And one more aspect I want to take a quick look at, Jupiter square Uranus. So another thing that Saturn-Uranus can have is a kind of deflating effect on Uranus's freedom, right? Saturn will burst the bubble. Now, Jupiter-Uranus aspects are quite the opposite. The bubble gets bigger and bigger and bigger and floats up high into the sky. And with Jupiter-Uranus, we can experience these quantum leaps, these sudden and amazing breakthroughs and successes, or even like a Deus ex machina kind of resolution. Just when we thought things were at their worst and we were at our darkest moment, suddenly we realized, poof, oh, it was all just a dream. Or Little Red Riding Hood is saved in the nick of time by the hunter who's just walking through the forest. And that's another thing at play now. So there's this weird mixture right now of optimism and fear, of tension, and kind of buoyancy. And I know at least for me, it's thrilling to see Trump's bubble get burst, for instance. And Trump is actually a Jupiter-Uranus type person. He's got the trine, and he's a perfect example of the shadow of Jupiter-Uranus with the kind of Midas touch inflation, Just the big, gaudy, uh, yeah, the big gaudiness, these kind of delusions of grandeur and cravings for glory, and he's kind of an Icarus figure. And so, with all of that inflation, right, Saturn can come along and just go poof, and down you fall. So, uh, anyway, putting this all together, the Mars makes things harder to handle because it makes us more reactive. Um, we're more likely to be set off, to be triggered. So it's important, I think, when Mars is conjunct Uranus, when Saturn is square Mars, when Saturn is square Uranus, we're going to have so much energy that just is going to want to find ways out, that it's important to put that energy somewhere into something constructive. Um, Physical exercise, grounding, breath work, whatever. Try not to blow up on the people around you. If you really need to go scream into a pillow, or punch a pillow, or punch a punching bag, or do a bunch of jumping jacks or push-ups or wall sits or whatever, do it. Because otherwise, you're more likely to just fall into one of the many stories that are available for you to fall into at this time. So that's all I'm going to say. Thanks.